Now it's time for Lefties Losing It, and she's done it again. We've brought you Kamala's array of accents previously, but this next one may be my favourite. Listen to how Kamala Harris, who is of Jamaican, Indian and Irish descent and grew up in California and Canada, listen to how she spoke earlier today.
You better thank a union member for the 5-day work week. You better thank a union member for sick leave. You better thank a union member for paid leave. You better thank a union member for vacation time.
Oh, how many accents are we going to hear from her in this campaign? Well, we got 2 in just a few hours today. Let's hear her. Let's hear how she spoke in Pittsburgh and then Boston. See if you can detect the subtle difference.
So, friends, 64 days. Let's just get through the next 64 days. How about that?
Meryl Streep, eat your heart out. Kamala is so authentic. But then wanting authenticity and consistency from Kamala is just asking for trouble. Listen to the passionate way she defends illegal immigrants who pay people smugglers to take them across the border, and then marvel at the enormous backflip just a year later.
A mother who pays a coyote to transport her child through their country of origin, through the entire country of Mexico, facing unknown peril to come here. Why would that mother do that? I will tell you. Because she has decided for that child to remain where they are is worse. But what does Donald Trump do? He says, go back to where you came from. That is not reflective of our America and our values, and it's got to end.
To be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border, do not come. Do not come. And I believe if you come to our border, you will be turned back.
Do not come, do not come. Of course, they did come because the Biden-Harris administration did nothing to stop the illegal immigration crisis. Record numbers have come in illegally every year of their administration. And remember Kamala and Joe telling us the anti-Israeli protesters had a point? This is the type of miscreant they are empowering. This woman in New York City today waving a Hamas flag on the day an American citizen horrifically injured, taken hostage and then executed by Hamas was buried. Just gross. And the dim-witted sheep were marching in big numbers in New York City, chanting that Palestinians should resist colonialism by any means necessary. I guess that includes rape, torture and murder. Now to some local lefties losing it here in the state of Victoria, where public libraries will be places of far-left LGBTQIA++ indoctrination. Not only will children have drag queen story time, but staff have been told not to use gendered language like boys and girls, and kids as young as 5 will be asked their pronouns.
Children as young as 5 will be asked if they identify as she, he or they as part of a new program being rolled out across public libraries in Victoria. Library staff are being told to ask what their preferred pronouns are for children, avoid gendered language and offer pronoun badges, pins or lanyards for any visitors. As part of the Rainbow Toolkit, Victorian libraries will also add books on gender diversity and promote drag queen storytime events.
Let's have an antidote to all that lefty lunacy with this sobering warning on censorship and the assault against free speech. Here is Constantine Kisson talking with former Australian Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson about the crackdown on so-called hate speech. And note, this conversation happened before the UK's latest bout of insanity, where people are being arrested for sharing memes and robust ideas about mass migration.
In Russia last year, 400 people were arrested for things that they said on social media. 400 people in Russia. Obviously, this country is very different. How many people do you think were arrested in Britain for things they said on social media last year?
Go on.
Take a guess.
I have no idea.
3,300.
Really? Arrested for what they'd said on social media?
Yeah.
What sort of things get you arrested?
Well, one example I give in my show is there was a young woman from Liverpool called Chelsea Russell. People can look this up. Her friend was killed in a car crash, a 19-year-old woman, and she posted the lyrics of his favorite song on her Instagram. And it was a rap song, so the lyrics contained several instances of the N-word. She was arrested, prosecuted, found guilty, given 500 hours of community service and a fine, tagged, and for a year she was under 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. curfew.
Oh, good.
In Britain.
In Britain.
In 2018.
In a letter to the House Judiciary Committee, Meta founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg revealed the Biden administration officials were putting pressure on him to censor content on his social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram. That included satire. But the revelations did not stop there. Zuckerberg also revealed he was warned by the FBI about a Russian disinformation campaign involving Hunter Biden. This saw Facebook and other social media giants ban or heavily suppress stories about Hunter Biden's laptop, including the Biden family's dodgy business dealings. Joining me now is author, independent journalist Michael Schellenberger, who broke the Twitter files story exposing the censorship industrial complex. Michael, these admissions by Zuckerberg are not only deeply disturbing, do they cross the line into criminality? Is this evidence of the FBI engaging in election interference?
Hey, Rita, it's great to be with you. Yeah, that's the most important question. I think the answer is yes. I now feel comfortable saying for the first time, given Zuckerberg's letter, that the FBI interfered in the elections in 2020. They waged their own disinformation campaign, naturally in the name of stopping alleged Russian disinformation. But it's important for viewers to know that the FBI had Hunter Biden's laptop since December 2019. They knew it was legitimate, authentic. They knew it was not Russian disinformation. They were also listening to Rudy Giuliani's telephone calls, so they knew that he had given the laptop to the New York Post. And they spent that summer basically programming or brainwashing social media executives at Twitter and Facebook, as well as journalists, into believing that there would be a Russian leak of hacked materials, knowing full well that that's not what was going on. So it's extremely illegal. It's illegal to engage in those disinformation operations against the American people, and it's obviously illegal for the FBI to interfere in elections.
And their campaign was enormously successful, wasn't it? Because the New York Post story, which was 100% accurate and legitimate, which the FBI knew, because as you said, they had the evidence of the laptop, it was buried. You couldn't even post it on Twitter. The New York Post's own Twitter page, their official account was banned. And likewise with Meta, with Facebook, the story was completely suppressed. So their influence here is undeniable. They buried that story. They completely convinced the American public, who were aware of the story, that it was Russian disinformation, or they never heard the story in the first place.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Rita. In fact, I was duped. I thought it was Russian disinformation at the time. I believed that not only that the 51, former CIA directors and intelligence officials were correct in assessing it as Russian disinformation, but also I thought that because Facebook and Twitter were independent entities that had evaluated it, that they could be trusted. And that was obviously wrong. They were also victims of a disinformation campaign. And I think what you said is very important for people to understand, that the censorship was bad, but really the power of it was to convince people that there was something wrong with the story, when, as you pointed out, the story in the New York Post was 100% accurate. There's never been anything proven wrong with it. It just was what it looked like, which is Hunter Biden dropped his laptops into a bathtub or a pool, took them to the computer repair store owner gave them to Rudy Giuliani and the FBI, and Hunter Biden never came back for them. That was all it was. And so there was a very elaborate brainwashing effort by the FBI. it's criminal, and somebody should be prosecuted and potentially incarcerated because these are very serious crimes.
And the media, the bulk of the media, was also eager to believe that. They discredited the story without really looking into it in any meaningful fashion when it mattered. Now they will admit it's real because there's no denying it. Now, despite Mark Zuckerberg being a lifelong Democrat, he donated around $400 million of his own money back in 2020 to fortify the election for the Democrats. Despite him making these admissions, you've still got the leftist media ignoring or questioning his evidence. The Atlantic was among the outlets to question Zuckerberg's motives and pretend this was just about clamping down on rampant COVID misinformation. What's it going to take, Michael, for the bulk of the US media to investigate this story properly?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you singled out the Atlantic because it's been one of the biggest advocates of censorship in the United States. It's a deeply snobby, elitist publication that thinks that the American people can't be trusted to make their own minds up. It believes that committees of experts should decide what we're allowed to see and say and read and hear online. And it's quite shocking. It's very much against the American tradition. In answer to your question, I think that, clearly there has to be, the voters have to express their preference for freedom at the ballot box. It used to be 25, 30 years ago when I first was involved in political work that the media would change its mind and then the politicians or the voters would follow them. At this point, the media are the most dogmatic institution in society. They're basically the brains of the Democratic Party. There's really, in fact, they're much more ideological than most Democratic politicians, in part because there's no consequence for them to be so dogmatic. And so what you end up seeing is that you see politicians needing to correct either their abuses, such as defunding the police or demanding censorship. And it's the media that ends up following the will of the people and the voters. So I think that's ultimately, we need a correction at the ballot box.
Now, let's talk about Brazil. The Supreme Court there has upheld a ban on social media site X, formerly Twitter, effectively shutting out more than 200 million people from using the popular app. We've seen mass protests in the country in recent months. And Michael, I do wonder whether shutting down X is really about stopping further dissent, because under Elon Musk, X has become a place where you can question the narrative, you can share information that perhaps in the past would have been suppressed. How do you see what's happening in Brazil right now?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, rightly wonder why Brazil's, important. People might think it has nothing to do with them. I think that we should look at Brazil as a laboratory for how totalitarian censors and censorship advocates would like to do around the world. In fact, they've made it very clear that they want to do what Brazil's doing. Brazil is no longer a free country. It's illegal to go onto the app X. It's shocking to believe, but you can't go on X. All of the other social media platforms, including Google and Facebook and Instagram, have bowed down to the government's demands. The government demands were extremely radical and extreme. They were basically demanding that politicians that they don't like and journalists that they don't like, not just that some of their content be censored, but that they be banned from those platforms and from every platform. So what you see here is really the 1984 that George Orwell warned about, where the government would control all the different media, and including, social media, deciding what can and can't be said publicly. It's extremely concerning. And of course, Brazil itself is a big, powerful country. It's the sixth largest country by size. It's 250 million people, but I think more than that, they're testing, what will be allowed. But I also feel comfortable at this point saying that Brazil is no longer a democracy, that it's a dictatorship of basically two men, President Lula and the Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who has been issuing these edicts, most of which are illegal. In other words, that violate the Brazilian constitution. So it's hard to overstate how serious and terrifying what's happening in Brazil. It's certainly what many of the people in our countries, Australia, the United States, Canada, Europe, it's something that many people in our own countries would like to see the government do here.
Well, that is the problem, because you do see often even people in the media cheering for more censorship, for more restrictions on free speech. What do you say to those on the left who think this sort of Brazilian style censorship that we have seen in recent weeks couldn't happen in a place like America? We do have people like legal scholar Jonathan Thurley warning that the Harris-Walz alliance is the most anti-free speech ticket of a major party in more than 2 centuries. The 2024 election is not far away. If we do have a Kamala Harris government, do you expect to see a further assault against free speech?
I do, and we should all be very concerned about that. You know, the 3 big things that the Brazilian government did, which was to demand censorship of so-called election misinformation, to deplatform disfavored politicians and journalists, and then to seek cross-platform bans. In other words, banning people not just from one social media platform, but from all of them. All 3 of those are things that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have endorsed. Tim Walz in December 2022 called for the censoring of so-called election misinformation. Misinformation, of course, is entirely in the eyes of the beholder. Misinformation just means information that I don't agree with or I don't think is accurate. But Kamala Harris in 2019 repeatedly called for Trump to be banned from Twitter and from every other social media platform. And she said that those platforms need to be regulated. And she's not the only Democrat that's advocated for that. The strongest case for censorship, sadly, was made by former President Barack Obama at Stanford in the spring of 2022, right before the Biden administration announced its Orwellian Ministry of Truth, the Disinformation Governance Board. So unfortunately, Democrats are absolutely obsessed with censorship. They want to see it. They want to see the Europeans do it. They want to see the Brazilians do it. We've now, tomorrow we'll be publishing evidence that the U.S. government has funded censorship activities in Brazil. So yeah, I think people should be very worried that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz as president, vice president would really try to crank up the censorship industrial complex and work with other countries, including Brazil, Australia, Europe, Canada, to impose this totalitarian censorship regime on the entire planet, which sadly is something that you can do in the age of the internet. Since we all get our information from the internet, there's only a few number of big platforms, and they want to control all of them.
And that censorship is often paid for by the taxpayer. So the taxpayer is funding their own muzzling. It's really quite perverse. Before you go, the election isn't far away. How much election interference do you expect to see from the elite, the swamp, the whatever you want to call them, the powerful and influential, from big tech to intelligence agencies and even the mainstream media, which are, some of them are just barracking for one side and ignoring stories that may hurt the Democrats? We've seen that just this week.
That's absolutely right, Rita. I think that the disinformation by the elites on behalf of the Democrats never really stopped after 2020. You know, everybody saw that the media insisted that Joe Biden was perfectly fine and that anybody who said differently was a far-right extremist. And then the debate occurred, and then they were all caught, embarrassed. And then they quickly reversed on a dime and said that Biden had to go and that he had to be removed in a very undemocratic way. So Kamala Harris was never selected or elected by the Democratic primary voters. It's just wave after wave of propaganda for Kamala Harris right now. It's basically only positive for Kamala Harris in the media and only negative for Donald Trump. The media traditionally would be where you would expect to find information about what the candidates would do. The media are just obsessed with things like the kind of foods that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz make, and kind of idiotic, superficial banter, dumb branding exercises, anything to avoid a serious conversation of the biggest issues facing the country, which are obviously inflation, the migration crisis, seemingly endless wars abroad, and no real leadership at home. So unfortunately, the media have descended into the propaganda apparatus that George Orwell feared, and the media is not satisfied with being able to just, basically, do propaganda. They also want to censor any accurate information, alternative sources of information that people might get through social media. So it's a really totalitarian instinct and desire for control that gets, it's always there, but it's particularly acute in the run-up to elections.
Control is the key word there, and it's, I think, why they hate Elon Musk so much, because he's bought a platform where you can question the dominant narrative and share opinions without fearing you're going to be banned, censored or suppressed. Michael Schellenberger, you do spectacular work. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thanks for having me, Rita.